I personally think that this election is going to be a very exciting one to witness and to be part of. If you can cast your mind back to 2009, if some of you in the room are old enough, you will recall that the last European elections, the Conservatives achieved the highest number of seats across the UK of 25, followed by UKIP, Labour and Liberal Democrats. And actually, recent opinion polls published just this weekend have shown how much things are in flux for this forthcoming election. A Sunday Times poll carried out put UKIP in the lead with 31%. A Comres poll put UKIP in the lead in terms of voting intention with 38%. Now, there's many politics students in the room, and I can see a lot of you here today, and we all know that what people say in a poll is very different to what people do on the day. But nonetheless, I think this is going to be an exciting election. It's an election we've already had TV debates. We've already had debates, demos, right in our very hometown of Sheffield just last week. UKIP were here launching their campaign. So I think it's going to be a fascinating few weeks, a fantastic thing to be part of, and it's brilliant to be holding the debate right here in Sheffield tonight. And so with that, I'd like to welcome you all and to welcome our guests that we have with us. On my stage right, we have two serving MEPs. We have Edward Macmillan-Scott, who is the longest serving MEP in what's now Yorkshire and the Humber. He was first elected in 1984 as a Conservative candidate, and in 2010, I won't say defected, but went over to the Liberal Democrats, who he's now standing for again. Next to me, we have Linda McCavan. She's served as an MEP for the Labour Party since 1998. Linda's from the region, she's from Bradford, so it's great to see someone from the region representing it. And on my left, we have two candidates who are hoping to make an electoral breakthrough this time. We have Sian Oakes from the Green Party. Sian's had a long and distinguished career working with children at disadvantage, working in schools, in areas as diverse as Uganda and Huddersfield. And next to me here we have Nick Allen, who is the chair of the Conservatives in Doncaster and is standing for the Conservatives for the first time. First time at this election?
I'm not a European candidate.
No. He's not a European candidate. Okay, he's a representative. Okay, my research was wrong. Fire me. So, with no further ado...
Thank you, Felicity, very much indeed, and a very warm welcome to you to this meeting. For braving the rain, those of you who had to come through it, remarkable downpour. I made a good start by asking Felicity what she was studying. So, there we go. I'll put my specs on now. No, my name is Edward Macmillan-Scott, and I was first elected in 1984 as a Conservative, and at that time, the Conservative Party was a bit more pro-European than it is now. So, in broad terms, I stayed in the same place, but the Tory Party moved to the right progressively over a certain period. I date it back to the Bruges speech by Mr. Delors, when Margaret Thatcher famously said, "We don't want that here." And Delors was then President of the European Commission. So, in 2005, David Cameron, in order to get elected as leader of the Conservative Party, committed himself to withdrawing his MEPs from the centre-right mainstream EPP group in the European Parliament. I thought that was a very bad idea and said so. I'd been leader of the Tory MEPs for 4 years, and I felt that we needed to be where the power was in the European Parliament. In 2009, we had a European election, and after the European election, we were told the nature of a new group that Cameron was going to form. We were told he'd done due diligence on the participants in this new group, but a very quick Google of some of the people involved showed me that they were rather undesirable, and in one particular case had a quite recent extremist past. And I stood against this individual. There was another candidate for Vice President, and I won, becoming thereby the first independent Vice President of the European Parliament. I think the important thing about this debate tonight is it sets the scene for 3 weeks of campaigning here on campus and elsewhere in Sheffield. It is an important election, and it's the first European election I've experienced, which I think will be about Europe. Because in previous years, we've had every 5 years a European election, which broadly speaking is based on national themes. I think the challenge by Nick Clegg to Nigel Farage, two TV and radio debates, have actually catalysed a new spirit about this election. Our position is, as Lib Dems, is that we're the party of in. We want to be in Europe and in work. We strongly believe that in a region like this, where some 300,000 jobs depend to some extent on the single market, that's about 1 in 10 jobs, we can't afford to put that at risk. So this European election on the 22nd of May is a sort of precursor to what might happen after the general election, when, if the Conservatives win the election, they have committed themselves to a referendum on our membership of the European Union. Now, that's not something the Liberal Democrats oppose. We would have a referendum ourselves if there were a fundamental shift in our relationship with the European Union. But that is not presently on the cards. So it's an important election. It's an important election too because you have a choice between parties. The party I now belong to in the European Parliament is the Kingmaker. The Liberal group with about 90 MEPs is right in the middle ground. And as a Vice President of the Parliament, I chair votes. And I can assure you, and I'm sure Linda will confirm this, if you're chairing a vote and the Liberals vote with the left wins. If the Liberals vote with the right wins. And in fact, we're on the winning side on 86% of votes in the European Parliament. That matters because the European Parliament now has formal co-decision powers with the Council. In other words, MEPs co-decide legislation directly with the EU governments. This was a new power under the Lisbon Treaty. So your vote matters. Speaking for myself, my portfolio as Vice President covers democracy and human rights. I've long been a campaigner for both worldwide. And I set up in 1990 the largest worldwide fund for democracy and human rights, the European Initiative, which currently spends about 150 million euros a year, thank you, worldwide. I've always opposed totalitarianism. I am proud that the European Union won in 2012 the Nobel Peace Prize for spreading human rights and democracy around the continent. That was an extremely important event, and it's one that I cherish. So I hope when you come to vote, if you do, and I hope you do, you think about the future, you think about employment, you think about the welfare of this country, you think about our security, you think about a greener Britain in a greener Europe, and you vote Liberal Democrat, the party of it. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks very much, Felicity, and thanks for the invitation to come to the Students' Union. I've not actually been in this new building before. I have been here many times before. My husband is the former General Manager of the Students' Union, Paul Blomfield, who was a local MP for this area. So I remember coming in when the building work was done. I live in Sheffield, and as was said earlier, I come from Bradford. I've been an MEP since 1998, and I've got an office in Wath-upon-Dearne. Now, maybe to say something, why you should bother to vote at all. If you look at our elections, for local elections and European elections, we do have some of the lowest turnouts in Europe. When my French colleagues very apologetically told me that only 60% of people voted in their local elections, that was awful. And the Italians told me that 80% of them are voting on average in local elections. It's difficult to explain that we have very, very low turnouts. So why should you bother voting in the European elections? Well, the reason to vote is because what I do as an MEP, and Edward and anybody else who's elected, we are lawmakers. We don't decide on 75% of the laws in this country, as has been said by UKIP on one of its posters. The House of Commons Library puts it like that EU law is at the origin of about 15% of British laws. And we don't decide on things like how much tax we're going to pay, whether or not we should go to war, how we should organise university education. But that doesn't mean that we do decide on important areas of legislation. And MEPs make those laws in conjunction with government ministers. The laws are not made by the famous Brussels faceless bureaucrats that the tabloids talk about. They're made by elected politicians in a decision-making process. And the kind of laws that we work on range across a range of areas. We sit on specialist committees, and my committee is is environment, food safety and public health. And I spend my time working on quite technical, detailed laws. For example, when we had the horse meat scandal, we had laws about the labelling of food. Where does your food come from? If food has to be labelled properly, less chance that big companies will try and put whatever into it. I've been working on Tobacco Products Directive. You heard about plain packaging for tobacco products, about the debate about that. We've just agreed in the European Union across 28 countries that actually packages will carry 65% big warnings, and that we're going to ban the sort of tobacco products, big tobaccos launched to lure young people into smoking. That's just been decided last month in the European Parliament with ministers. We just had a cap on bankers' bonuses. Did you watch the debate about RBS? And the bankers complaining they wanted to have triple their annual salary altogether in income, about the cap on bankers' bonuses. That's an EU law that MEPs worked for to get on the table. So just like as it matters in any decision-making process, it matters who sits in Sheffield Town Hall and who takes those decisions. So it matters in the European Parliament who takes those decisions as well. Whether they're on the left or the right or the centre, like Edward, and the Green parties. The political views that they have will influence the decisions that they make. What kind of politician am I? What are my priorities? Well, I'm very strong on climate change. I've worked on legislation to cut the emissions from our power stations, to cut the emissions from car vehicles, to get clean air, big issue around the university, around Broom Hill for people, air quality legislation. I chair the Fair Trade Group in the European Parliament, and I'm very committed as well to making sure we have good rights at work. One of the things the EU does do is work to get a level playing field in terms of regulations across the EU, whether it be in environmental legislation or work, or your rights at work. And Ed Miliband will launch our campaign tomorrow in London. And one of the things he'll talk about is the need to get rid of zero-hours contracts, for example. Unfair contracts at work. Since I've been an MEP, we put through legislation which gives every worker in this country 4 weeks paid holiday. If you work part-time, if you work on Saturdays, you work in a bar, you've got rights to holiday, that is only there because of an EU law that Labour MEPs push for. And those are the kind of things that I stand for, and I hope you will think about going out and voting Labour in these elections.
My name's Sian Oakes for the Green Party, I'm very proud to say. I got into politics when I was about 8 years old, I suppose, when I started to get worried about animal extinctions and also injustice between humans, the inhumanity of man to man. But it was a long time before I formally got into politics. I was a teacher and then in local government. And I could never get excited about it, and I'm very impressed that a lot of you are quite young and that you've realised that this is a really important thing to be in. I was not as bright as you at that stage, obviously. But through my life, I got to the point, actually spending some time in Uganda, where I thought, I can't hang around any longer. I'm so worried about what is going on in the world, right across the world. And spending time living in Uganda for a few years, I could see Europe from an African perspective. And it really made pieces drop into place for me in the jigsaw puzzle of the big picture. And I think that's perhaps where the Greens specialise in the big picture and looking long term rather than in short term issues. Having said that, the Greens in Europe are an extremely strong force. I think they're the fourth largest group, is that right, Linda? In the European Parliament. Obviously we work with other players within the Parliament, but I think where the Greens differ from the others fundamentally is that we challenge the whole growth paradigm, the worldview that says that we have to we have to compete with each other between nations and have infinite growth on a finite planet. It can't be done. And if you look around the world at the moment, at the mining, at the fracking, at the appalling human rights abuses because of those things, where people are trying to defend their patch of this little planet from the devastation and total exploitation being caused by huge transnational corporations who have got the bit between their teeth, who have nothing to virtually nothing to rein them in, where police forces and armies of those states are actually on the side of the corporations against the people. It's that the Greens have seen and are fighting to stop. And the Greens, in terms of Europe, say yes, yes and yes. Yes, there should be a referendum. We should have proper debate. We should have much more really good information from school upwards. I think schools is an issue. I'm not sure how many of you found you got a lot of information in school, turned out to voting age finding that you didn't have much information. I think that's quite a problem. Also, we say yes to being in Europe, but we say yes to reforming Europe. Europe must not be on the sides of the multinational corporations. It must move to be on the side of people and planet. And that's the major difference between the Greens and everybody else. And the thing to remember with the European elections is this is proportional representation. We struggle in national and local elections because in this country it's first past the post voting system, which I'm sure you all know, but that for the Greens makes a huge difference. We have one MP, even though when people fill in questionnaires and polls about what they believe in, and they're then given advice about which party they should vote for, the majority of people who do that online, I think it's called Policies for You probably know it, on that website, most people are advised they should be voting Green. But they kind of didn't know that because, of course, often they don't know it because the Greens have difficulty in getting out there because we don't get the airtime that other parties do, and of course we don't have the money, we don't get the corporate sponsorship and so on. So I'll be good and finish at that point. Thank you.
Hi. I'm not a candidate for anything other than a council seat in Doncaster, and I only found out about this, which is a very good council seat, by the way, and I like it, and I want to represent it on the council, but as you live there, you're not going to vote for me. So I'm going to fudge along like this and hope you laugh along with me, because sadly the Conservative Party couldn't find anyone more authoritative than me to come and speak tonight, because Mr McMillan Scott defected. Sadly. Well, he didn't defect. We don't go into that. Anyway, the gist of it is we're not as bad as UKIP. As you know, as the Prime Minister told plenty of us. And UKIP are not here because of the bad weather, funnily enough. Isn't it suspicious that an openly gay homosexual from Doncaster, Conservative like me, comes along and then there's a flood. And when Mr Farage came along, was it last week, no one came along to see him. And you've all come here to see a council candidate from Doncaster. Anyway, the gist of our policy is basically we want our in-out referendum, and the only way you're going to get that is if you vote. Is that okay? Sorry. Can't think of anything else to say.
Honesty, politics. We're going to go over to Twitter now and start taking some questions. So, we've got one question, first of all, which is from Liam Harding, who's asked, working with the EU to prevent a catastrophe is vital. How do you see future solutions planning out and what's your role? And that's a question to everyone. And in the interest of fairness, we'll take them in alphabetical order of the party, which means it was you first.
Well, obviously, I mean, the Conservatives are now in a group that's quite separate from the previous group we belonged to. So our role is enhanced because we have a greater say amongst other Conservatives. We are now linked clearly to those Conservatives in Europe, which has given us an opportunity to really voice on behalf of British interests. Because previously we were happy to pursue all sorts of different agendas and all sorts of different compromises with different parties. Now we have a much stronger base from which to do that. But we do need more Conservative MEPs. And in Yorkshire we have a very good chance of managing to get a second Conservative MEP re-elected because I think we were about 3,000 votes behind last time. And with UKIP and the BNP in decline, it looks as if we could get the next Conservative here, and that would really help benefit pursuing, you know, what Lynn said.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. Over to Sian. The question's just there by way of reminder. Thank you.
Well, this one, climate change is a somewhat quite a large problem. If you take it seriously, and most scientists now do, and I think most of the public now do as well, we certainly do. And it's exactly the kind of thing that the European Union is there for, to try to work together to make the massive changes which are needed to deal with something like climate change. Well, the more Greens we get into Europe, the better, because obviously we really focus on that kind of thing, as well as other kind of catastrophes. I mean, environmentally, the sea is the most, it's sort of, there it is, and we can't quite see what's underneath it, but it is an appalling, well, desert really now, compared with what it should be. The species, the biodiversity is disappearing. In terms of eating the products of the sea, we'll probably all be relegated to a diet of jellyfish. There won't be much else left very soon. Now the EU has already made some improvements in this, and our MEPs will have more detail on that than I will, but that's the kind of thing that obviously the European Union is extremely valuable for. Thank you.
Alphabetical order. Labour, yes.
Yeah. I just want to be clear what the question means. Is it about climate change? Who is the person who asked the question here?
Yeah, it does say climate catastrophe.
Does it say climate catastrophe? Well, that would have been a lot clearer then. I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, though for those who follow climate change discussions, you'll know that there are we're trying to get global agreements on climate change. The last big climate conference was in 2009 in Copenhagen. I went to those talks in 2009. And what was interesting for me is that it brought home that the world's changing. You know, we live in a world where we've got, a friend of mine went to China, and there might be some Chinese students here, I know you've got lots at the university, but she went to a city in China with 30 million people that I'd never heard of. It's half the size of the UK. And when I went to the climate talks in China, Obama came, it was like a big sensational moment because he'd just been elected, everyone wanted to shake his hands and get a bit of that stardust. But when he came to the talks, he didn't want to meet Gordon Brown or it was, what's his name, French president, and it was Sarkozy and Angela Merkel separately. He wanted to meet Brazil, India, the European Union, and they sat down together and they talked about discussions on climate change. And that's because the only way to actually influence those big global talks now is for the UK to join forces with other like-minded countries in the European Union. The same's true at the World Trade talks, and the same's true at most of the discussions. Think about the Ukrainian crisis at the moment. Where is William Hague going to have most of his discussions? Who did Obama go and talk to? He went to Brussels to speak to the collective voice of the European Union. And that's where decisions on these issues are taken. And that's why we've got to be at the top table in Europe. We can't afford to be Norway. You know, Norway's not in the EU, pays into the EU budget, obeys all EU laws. Norwegian politicians come and see people like me when they want to influence the EU law, because they can't have any say over them. So we've got to be there, and that's why on climate change, it's the EU that gives Britain clout in international climate change talks.
Yeah. Well, it's a pity that UKIP isn't here to outline their policy on climate change.
I heard it yesterday.
And I hope Jane Collins won't mind me saying it's a great pity she's not here, because I'd like to have met her. I have actually challenged her to a debate. First she said yes, then she said no, then she said yes, then she said no again. And now she's not here. I don't blame her for not being here, because of course she's been held up by other factors. But I became absolutely committed to the climate change debate some years ago. And just before the Copenhagen climate summit in 2009, the week before, I organised in Brussels a hearing at which the key speaker was Sir Paul McCartney, and the others were Rajendra Pachauri, who was the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and Olivier de Schutter, who is the UN Rapporteur on the Right to Food. This was about the things we eat affecting the climate. I mean, the fact is that meat production is more hazardous to the environment than the whole of the transport sector. And I had actually given up eating meat a few months beforehand, so I wasn't just parroting something. I do think it's something we can individually affect, not just by our own behaviour as to diet, but also as to behaviour generally. And I'm really impressed by the way that the European Union has kept in the lead on this. And despite the fact that at Copenhagen, actually I think I'm right in saying that Obama did not want the European Union in the same room when he was trying to do a deal, but I think the EU has stuck to its guns and remains the leading bloc on climate change reform. And of course, within our own coalition government, I think that it's fair to say the slogan that David Cameron used at the last general election, vote blue and you get green, was slightly adjusted later when he called climate change policies crap. So the evolution of a greener government, a greener coalition, has actually been as a result of two Secretaries of State, Chris Huhne and Ed Davey now, both Lib Dems, pushing very hard for substantial changes in this country. So there's a lot to be said for the European Union's leadership on this subject, and a lot to be said too for the policies we're putting through in this country.
Thank you. And actually, by the powers of text message, Jane is here, and she said, we need to give the British public an immediate referendum on whether to leave the EU. I am not sure which disaster you mean, so perhaps we should text her back.
I've done that, yeah.
Okay. But there are a few associated with the EU, but in the name of democracy, people have the right to decide what a democracy is the biggest disaster of all. But I will give her the right to reply to Rex's question.
Back.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just make one observation on Jane's absence? She's going to be a very good UKIP MEP because they're practically always absent from the European Parliament.
No comments. Okay. Question 2 is from Keshia Jakatine. What can be done about the continuing low level of knowledge about how the EU works, as evidenced by a recent Eurobarometer survey? And I think we'll start with our serving MEPs to answer that, if you will, please. Linda.
I think it is very difficult to talk about Europe in the UK at the moment, because we have a kind of hysterical national debate at the moment where it's difficult to talk about the real issues on the ground, the sort of things that we're doing every day. And all too often newspapers have an agenda to run silly stories about the EU. I think we need all our national parties to talk honestly about the EU, to explain to people. For example, I explain that EU laws don't come from the faceless bureaucrats. They're decided by us and the ministers together. But sometimes ministers from our own governments pretend they've had nothing to do with those laws, unless those laws are very popular and they think everyone's going to like them. If there's a difficult issue, we'll sort of say, oh, that's the problem in Brussels. In the House of Commons, for example, our members of Parliament should hold ministers to account when they decide on those laws, so that there's a lot more understanding in Westminster about how laws are taken, how laws are decided. Because the EU is not a perfect place. There's lots of things, and it isn't actually a place, the EU. The EU is simply the collection of 28 governments and the MEPs from the 28 countries who make decisions. And the decisions that they make depend on the people who make those decisions. Just like in a town hall, just like in Westminster, those decisions are made. And we need to try and get to an understanding that decisions are, that it is a political process of decision making, just like any other political process. Not everything will be decided there. But certain things aren't, and debate them in a more mature way. But it's difficult with our media, and I think the onus is on the national, all the party leaders and all the parties to go out and to explain to people why we're members of the European Union, what are the different options for leaving, and why all the mainstream parties actually want us to stay in.
Thank you. Over to you, Edward.
Well, this dilemma about how to impart what the European Union does has been going on for years. And as Linda says, it's not helped by the rather harsh national debate we have, which tends to blot out the European Union and its activities, which isn't to say that they're not important. I will make one concession to those who say that European politics is dull. It is because, unlike Westminster, which is a confrontational chamber with two sides facing each other and a very combative style of debate, which I think is attractive to people, sometimes repellent, but nevertheless weekly interesting sparring between the leader of the opposition, the Prime Minister and other senior politicians, and the backbenchers too, is a sort of forum of the nation. The European Parliament will never be a European level Congress. It is always going to be the sort of place where people like Linda can work on her committee on detailed legislation, getting it right, but actually cooperating, and this is the crucial point, with other parties. That's what it's about. It's about arriving at a consensus across the European Union, 28 countries, 500 million people. You cannot have the sort of confrontational politics which you see in Westminster. Therefore, it is less interesting to watch. It is less interesting to observe at first hand, but it is nevertheless very important. If only 15% of our laws come from Brussels, then it's important. I think it's probably slightly more than that. I think that's a slight underestimate. I know the figure you've got. Others say it's much, much more. UKIP says it's 75%. But let's say it's 20%. Nevertheless, these are important issues, whether it's on transport or the environment. These are things that affect us in our daily lives. And when I slightly misunderstood Liam's question about averting a catastrophe, I thought he might have been talking about Ukraine and what's going on over there at the moment. In terms of our future security, it is absolutely essential that we work together as a European Union. That's what's happening. So when William Hague attends meetings, they make decisions about further sanctions and so on. So a safer Europe, a greener Europe, a more prosperous Europe, yes. But who makes it so is the combined consensus process involving the European Parliament, involving all European governments, and the national parliaments too. That's the way laws are made in Europe. It is democratic. It can be a bit stuffy. There's a committee of national parliaments, which I used to co-chair for 5 years, and its discussions were ponderous in the extreme. It's called COSAC. That's its French mnemonic. I nicknamed it Prozac, because it was quite stultifying. But nevertheless, it was important stuff. It was important stuff. So take an interest in what goes on in the European Union, and in particular, in this election to come.
Thank you. We'll go over to you next, Sian, please, as someone who's hoping to enter the Parliament. How will you convey to your constituents more about its work and infuse participation?
Thank you. Yeah, as I said earlier, the green worldview is looking at the big picture, and I think in terms of how do we get more people interested in that bigger picture when people are rushing around increasingly sort of struggling to make ends meet, so that it's harder and harder. The more they're struggling, the less they have the chance or the time or the energy to try and sort of consider the bigger picture, which is what something like a union of a whole lot of states can look at and is trying to do. It's obviously going to be harder. Coming back to schools, which, I mean, I was a teacher, I'm very concerned that young people are often not having the chance in schools to look at what they're really interested in. I did research with children, and the younger they are, the more concerned they are with fairness and justice, and they are into the big picture. And sort of into people being kind to each other and kind to animals and communities working together and the environment being looked after. Those are the things that kids instinctively care about. And I remember, as I said, how I felt when I was 8 years old or so. And I think our school system is sadly cramped up with competitive, so-called sort of academic stuff, which is, to many children, is not appropriate at all. There's a few that are, you know, sort of high-flying academic types who want to sort of focus in, but in general, children want to deal with sort of human issues. And I mean, I used to teach English, drama, that kind of thing, where you can grapple with those things. Now, I think the arts and so on, humanities, art and music and so on, should be given much more space in schools. Schools in general should be given more space. They are being treated like it's like a factory education system at the moment, which squeezes out the sort of time and space to consider these bigger issues, which is what the kind of European Parliament is about.
Thank you. And Nick, over to you, please.
I work in a school currently, and we've just changed part of our what used to be called PSE education to include citizenship, and part of it's a module on the EU and how it works. And a lot of the children there have benefited greatly from it. Basically, it's that you just need to teach about it and talk about it in schools where the younger generation will pick up about it. I don't know how this is going to change low-level knowledge amongst older people, or indeed myself. I think I've demonstrated my absolutely terrible lack of knowledge, almost UKIP-like lack of knowledge. But anyway, we need to get into schools and teach about it there. I remember the first time I learned about it was not A-level politics, it was first year at uni, a module on European studies, which wasn't particularly adequate. But I do feel that if we have a consistent approach in schools, that would definitely help. Perhaps teachers just trained teaching about European studies. Is that?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And we've also had a response from Jane Collins of UKIP as well. And she said, well, this is why we have MEPs. 40 years of the EU and people are still in the dark as to how it works. Only UKIP MEPs tell it as it is. Since 1973, the 6 treaties have virtually taken over the lawmaking process for the EU members, and legislation is increasingly binding, and legislation is legally binding for EU members. Treaty of Rome, Single European Act, Maastricht, Lisbon Treaty, Work Directives, loss of vetoes, Committee of Regions, loss of fishing rights, introduction of the European immigration, foreign policy, environmental, citizenship imposed, all a part of the 6 treaties. Okay, we've got a third question from Henry Matthews, great surname, no relation. What will you do to support students? And would anyone like to begin first? Or I'll pick at random. Jean.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, the Greens think that education should be free. We think it's completely the wrong thing that loans were introduced and have sort of put people into debt, young people into debt straight away. We think that's the wrong way to go. And we would completely change that system. Young people need there's all that potential. Young people have the future in front of them, and they should be supported. They should not be immediately sunk into debt. And education should be available for everybody who wants it. It's quite straightforward, really. You may say, well, that's. I mean, one of the issues here. We come to Sheffield and you see all the student accommodation. Education is an enormous industry for the UK, and we educate people from overseas. There are probably several reasons why people come here from overseas to higher education. And if we keep going along the track that we are in, I think we'll gradually tail off with this huge area of industry that we're in. We need to reform it. We need to be very careful, because people will start to lose interest in British education or UK education if it doesn't modernise. I don't know how it feels for you in the system at the moment, but I think it's economics, for example, has been busy teaching people old-style economics, when in fact we need a radical rethink about economics, for example. So I think there needs to be very careful consideration, and we should not be treating young people like battery chickens, seeing how many we can cram into accommodation, how much money we can get out of them, and how much debt they will end up in.
Thank you very much. And we'll go over to you, please, Linda.
Well, I mean, I don't know who's asked the question. Sorry, so see yeah. I mean, there's issues about what we can do in the European Parliament to support students is limited because, as I said, how we organise education, fund our universities, fund our students is a matter for the Westminster. We don't decide that, and that's things to discuss with the MPs. At European level, we do have, I don't know if anyone's here, any Erasmus students are here, any people or going on Erasmus courses, yeah, there are some here. I used to work in Brussels in the 1980s, was involved in trying to set up these big youth exchange bureaus and running that, and it has and we've got a bigger scheme to allow students to study as part of their courses. Sheffield University is also a massive recipient of EU grants. I've been up at the teaching hospital, and there's some, I think, bigger than most MEPs would appreciate, sort of £5 million into a research project into Parkinson's disease involving students, and not just research, but bringing the best international students into Sheffield to do that research. There's lots of things the EU is involved in spending money on research, and that budget's just gone up. The new programmes are much bigger than the old programmes, and that's where I think EU money should go. On the national issues about students, the loan system isn't working by the government's own admission now. The actual repayment of loans is actually collapsing, and the government's not getting back as much money as it thought it would. And so they're looking again at how the loans are going to work. You know that many of you will be paying very expensively for your education. We made a pledge to cut that 6,000 in the short term, also to review again how student finance works. When I went to university, 8% of young people 18 went to university. It's now 50% of young people. So obviously there has to be a source of funding has to be identified. I think we should look at a different system. I think we could look at a graduate tax, for example, so that how much you pay back, and it depends on what you earn after you graduate. I think there are different ways of funding the system. But at the moment, the current system's not working, and it does need revision.
Thank you. And over to Nick next, please.
Okay. Two things. Basically, I think greater opportunities for international travel. That could easily be looked at. There are all sorts of different scholarships and bursaries available to help undergraduates or college students access education abroad and to travel around the EU, and there needs to be increased help. Also, in terms of helping students, we need to take languages education seriously, right back not just to university students, but into nurseries as well, because we do have a falling lack of language skills in the country. Sorry, do you want me to hold it? It's just offering.
Take initiative.
I know, take initiative. I'm a Tory. Right. Anyway, and the second thing is supporting other institutions like the Open University, which recently celebrated its 40th birthday since its Royal Charter. And it's a brilliant institution. It's a really, really different way of learning, and it's a fantastic opportunity for lots of people to engage with degree level education in a non-traditional setting, in a non-traditional way. And it's absolutely global. I'm not sure of people, but absolutely global. One of the 5th largest universities in the world. It's an amazing thing, and we really need to embrace and support that. That's the sort of place we need to be taking a lot more of our higher education to.
Thank you. And demonstrating how to use a microphone, we'll go over to Edward. Thank you very much.
Yes, I don't think there's any particular political side to this in terms of how the EU or how MEPs can help students. Except to say this, the European Parliament in 2013 increased the Erasmus budget by 40%. It's seen as such a valuable programme by so many people over the years that we felt very strongly that it should be actually enhanced and the funding increased, and by a significant amount. And that is quite an important thing to bear in mind, because the governments and the Commission did not want that increase, but we felt it was important, especially at a time when, and I don't need to tell you, of horrendously high youth unemployment in certain parts of Europe, not so much in the UK, but certainly in places like Spain and Greece, it is absolutely terrifying, the youth unemployment. The other thing I'd say about this is that anybody who's interested in human rights and democracy, this is a plug for a fantastic postgraduate course at the run by the University of Padua, but actually based on the Venice Lido in an old monastery. Anybody in this room or listening or outside who wants to do 6 months in Venice and then 6 months in another European Union university may do so on a fantastic course on human rights and democracy. It's actually funded by the programme I set up, the European Initiative. But it has had always a very strong British component. So if anybody wants to know more about it, ask me afterwards.
Yeah, are there any job vacancies there? It sounds fantastic. Okay, we haven't had a response from Jane yet. We've got one now. Is it come in? And she says, remove student loans and replace with grants. No young person should start working life in debt. Scrap nonsensical 50% of school leavers going to university and guide school leavers into apprenticeships. EU students in Scotland do not pay fees because of the EU. After leaving the EU, we would be more competitive in business, therefore creating more employment. Out of the EU, into the world. Okay.
We're going to pay for that with their flat tax. All that.
We've got a question now from Christy McMorrow. Is it worth risking workers' rights and the diversity of our country and universities on a one-off referendum? And I'm going to ask the Conservative representative first, please. Can you put it back there?
I know. Hello. I don't think that we would be putting all that at risk with an in-out It's basically very democratic to allow the British people to decide whether we want to stay in or to go out of Europe. Right.
Thank you. And in the spirit of the recent televised debate, we'll go straight to Edward, please.
I don't think it makes sense to commit to a referendum in 2017, as David Cameron has done, and go further this week by saying that he would insist in any coalition that the coalition partner had to go along with this proposition. Because at the present time, there is nothing new in our relationship with the European Union about which to hold a referendum. I have said earlier, and this has always been the Lib Dem position, if there's a fundamental change, then by all means have a referendum. Because if there was a shift in the relationship between the UK and the rest of the European Union, fine. I don't think there is going to be a fundamental shift in our relationship with the rest of the European Union. I think the Eurozone might create, increasingly is doing so, new rules for itself, but that is, as it were, a smaller number of EU countries than the whole of the European Union. It certainly doesn't include the UK. So I think the timing is wrong. I think it actually destabilizes our business planners who have to think ahead. And it is certainly the case that when 8 out of 10 companies surveyed by the CBI, Confederation of British Industry, last autumn, 8 out of 10 said they wanted to stay in. That was a slight game changer in this debate. Because talking to people around the region, I have yet to meet a business partner who doesn't moan a bit about the EU, but nevertheless says it's absolutely essential we stay in. So why David Cameron has given this pledge is because he is in a party which has become, as I said earlier, increasingly Eurosceptic, and where now the dominant thinking about Europe is out. And I find this, frankly, a tragedy, and I said so at the Lib Dem Spring Conference in York. It is a tragedy that the Conservative Party has become so Eurosceptic, because there should be a sort of consensus about our international relationships. Yes, agreement between the parties about certain key things, and that should include the European Union. And I'm afraid it no longer does. Nick may not want to comment on this, and I don't expect, courageous though he is standing as a Conservative candidate in Doncaster, that he will want to do so. But it is, to my mind, a great pity that one of our great parties has taken this turn.
Thank you. And we'll go over to Sean next, please.
Yeah, the Greens want a referendum, but I feel that we do need a much more grown-up debate about it than has currently happened. And as been mentioned before, our media doesn't help. We have this sort of argy-bargy, this in, out stuff, which is no help to anyone. We need a proper discussion about it before a referendum, because currently the debate is not of very high quality, I don't think.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, please, Linda.
So whose question?
Own up.
No, yeah. I think if we look at the history of why David Cameron made the pledge, it's quite interesting. Because he came to power telling his party, would they ever stop banging on about Europe? And actually he made several speeches about why we didn't need a referendum, and kept saying that. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, what changed? Was there a shift in the balance of power to Europe from the UK? No. What changed was that David Cameron, who's a weak leader, was put under enormous pressure by his own backbenchers. I mean, we used to talk about the Tories having problems on Europe in the 1990s, when John Major had a rebellion on Maastricht. I think about 22, people remember, about 22 Tory MPs rebelled.
Isn't that many?
It's handy, you compare with now, it's 100 rebelled.
I think there were 6 bastards.
Six back, yeah, we won. Yeah, that was later on, but that was exactly right. There was this, yeah, and John Major. They study that in history now, like the early 90s. It's not a.
It's my British politics history module.
No, I met some students who I went to a meeting, and they said I was talking about general elections, and they said. We talked about Neil Kinnock losing in 1992, and they said, yeah, we did that in our history class, which made me feel very, very old.
Sheffield Wednesday.
So, you know, David Cameron's under enormous pressure within his own party, and that is why he's promised a referendum. It's nothing to do with Britain's interests or how he feels about the issue. So Labour's been very clear, like the Lib Dems, we said, if there's already on the statute book a law which says that if there's any major treaty change, it means a shift in power to the European Union, there will be a referendum. And what we've said is, it won't be on that particular treaty change, we'll have an in-out referendum at that point. But the idea of having arbitrarily picking a date in 2017, it's all to do with keeping the Tory backbenchers quiet and nothing to do with what's in this country's interest. And I meet people all the time. People are looking to make investments in this country, businesses, and it's just, I was up at the university a few months ago, visiting a major research project here, and the academics were horrified when I said to them, you know, if the Tories were for some awful reason to win the election and have their referendum and people voted no, that all this would stop, and all these research fellows that are coming are flying between, the guy's German, top doctor, head of this research, all this could stop. They were horrified, and I think people have to understand really what's at stake here. And as for rights at work, the Tories have actually made it absolutely clear that when they talk about reforming the European Union, their top priority is to reform what they call the social chapter, which is to get rid of the European laws that guarantee people's rights at work. They really hate this, the Tories. They don't like the idea that we have laws that give people a right by law to 4 weeks paid holiday, that give you the right to 1 day off a week by law, which we've had since the year 2000, that give part-time workers equal rights with full-time workers, that give agency workers some protection in the workplace. We actually need more protection in the workplace in this country. We've heard today from the government's own research, 1.5 million people on zero-hours contracts, care workers who, I don't know if you know that, the care workers looking after elderly people who don't get paid between their placements. So they get paid for the 15 minutes they work with an elderly person, and then they have to go half an hour maybe walking, and then they get paid again. That kind of thing ain't right. And these things have to change, and that's what the laws at the European level of workers' rights are about. It's about not having companies compete in terms of work rights at work. And the Tories have said they want to get rid of those rights, and I think that's a really good reason not to vote for them.
Thank you very much. As someone who worked for a long time on 0 hours contracts, I would agree with a lot that it was not good. Okay, we've got our last question of the evening, which is from Lucy Bowen. To all candidates, how do you think the EU helps and also hurts the UK economy? And we'll go along the table in order, starting with Edward, please.
I do not think I can answer how the European Union hurts the British economy. As I said earlier, in this region, probably about 300,000 jobs depend directly on our relationship with the European Union. That is the single market. And that's about 1 in 10 jobs. And the United Kingdom is host to over 400 multinational companies, whereas Germany, I think, is 88, France, 74. So the environment, the combination of Britain's relatively light touch legislation, including, if I may say so, on some of the things that you were talking about just now, Linda, is attractive to outside investors. Take Tata Steel, for example, which is obviously of interest to Sheffield. They would not be in Britain if Britain was not in the European Union. So the environment for international investors is a very benign one. Secondly, the opportunities that it gives to British companies to sell freely, without tariffs, without duties, without customs dues, across a market of 500 million people, and the fact that the European Union is currently negotiating, for example, a free trade agreement with the United States, which could be immensely valuable, actually to both partners. So almost everything I can think of is benign about the European influence on our economy. If I try and think of something that is not helpful, I would probably point to the way in which the common agricultural policy and the common fisheries policy have distorted those industries. And fortunately, because the European Parliament now has co-legislative powers with the Council, with ministers, on both of those, we are now reforming. So that the CAP, for example, I'm very conscious that in places like Sheffield, I've been meeting Grow Sheffield today and going to food banks and so on, there is a problem in this country and elsewhere across Europe where the most deprived people are having to rely on handouts. And the European Parliament insisted on maintaining our spending, indeed increasing it, on the most deprived, in a fund worth 3.5 billion euros over 7 years. Farmers, sometimes very rich farmers, get 100 times that in terms of subsidy. That is completely indefensible. And we want to reverse that. In the common fisheries policy, I brought Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall to Brussels to launch his campaign against fish discards, that is throwing fish away into the sea to fulfill quota. And as a result of the pressure from the European Parliament, that is now going to come to an end. So the European Parliament is having an effect on some of those less helpful aspects of EU policy. But on the economy, it's all, in my view, benign.
Thank you. Over to you next, please, Linda.
When I think about who comes to see me to talk about the work that we do in the European Parliament, it's actually companies. Most, as Edward has said, companies moan. Companies are always moaning about red tape and something that they don't like. But one thing that most companies like less than a new EU law is 28 different national laws on how they should operate. Because if you have 28, because if we didn't have we have a single market for goods, companies here make things, sell them all over Europe. If we didn't have a single law, each government could have its own rules. Each government could say we don't want that in our additive in our food, or they'll try and protect and stop them being able to export. We have different standards for cars across Europe. That would make it very difficult for our car industry, which is actually doing quite well at the moment, to export to Europe. But also, it's not just companies. Now, UKIP are trying to say, it's all for big companies. It's not at all. Trade unions, most trade unions and trade unionists support the membership of the EU because they see the EU as a way to actually get a level playing field in terms of right to workers across Europe. I was in London yesterday speaking to all the major green groups, the World Wildlife Fund, the RSPB, Friends of the Earth, but all these big green groups. And they all want the EU to work as well because they recognise that environment policy, you need to work together on environment policy to have sensible policies to influence the big global talks on climate change, the big global talks on protecting biodiversity. So are there things at EU level that I disagree with? Yes, of course there are. When we make the laws, we're making a law affecting 28 countries. We've got different parties trying to agree those laws. We don't always get everything we want in those laws, but it is a big consensus. And if I look at the net impact over years and years, I would say that on the whole, compared with other parts of the world, the EU has had a good influence on politics. We've got rid of some of the worst chemicals off. When we've acted on chemicals, we've taken them off the European market and off the global market because other parts of the world react. When we banned testing of cosmetics and animals, we did that in Europe first, but then all the companies who want to sell into our market had to stop testing on animals too. So that had a huge impact on the cosmetics industry. And many of the car industry, we're getting cleaner cars because the EU market, the biggest in the world, says we want cleaner vehicles, and that impacts on the whole global market. Sometimes we don't win everything. I've just done a big law on tobacco products directive. I wanted to go further than we got in the end. But it's a massive step forward compared with the status quo. We've now got the most advanced tobacco control measures in the world in the European Union. We're the first part of the world to bring in to bring in big picture warnings on tobacco, to take lipstick style cigarettes off the markets. So you don't win everything, but you actually gain a lot by working together. And on the area, we haven't talked about development policy and human rights. Everyone knows more on human rights than I do. But in those areas, the EU can have a big impact on other countries and development policy and trying to create a lot fairer systems in many countries.
Thank you. Over to you, Nick. How do you think the EU has helped and hurt the UK economy?
Okay, it's helped us primarily because it's basically a marketplace. Where it's hurting us is it hasn't stopped there. And it's now turning into what looks like a super state. And that just is not right. It's not what we voted for. And it's on that basis that a voting Conservative, you're guaranteed to get the in-out referendum in 2017.
Thank you. And Sian?
Thank you. Well, it depends on the sort of EU that we have, and that depends on who people vote for to stand to take up those seats in the European Parliament, which parties. The Greens, as I say, are wanting a different paradigm and working very hard towards a Europe which is about fairness, justice, better workers' rights, some of the things that Linda mentioned. But underlying all of this is this worldview of growth, infinite growth. Now, there's recently been the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. This is something which the Greens call the Big Bad Law, which the old grey parties, as we call them, and UKIP, actually agree with. The other parties seem to think that this law, which is to make a partnership between the States, the United States and Europe, to sort of, it basically gives more power to corporations. If this came into effect, this law, it would mean that a large corporation, for example, Monsanto, a genetic modification specialist, could sue Europe, for example, for stopping it making profits with its products, very nasty chemicals and genetically modified seeds and so on. Now the Greens are adamantly against the TTIP, everybody else is for it, which shows where we're fundamentally different. Now, so therefore, coming back to the question, the answer to that question is what sort of a Europe we have. If it is a good Europe, which is promoting justice and not horrible chemicals and good human rights, animal rights, workers' rights, welfare harmonisation, peace. I was born shortly after the Second World War, and I'm just wondering how long it's going to remain peaceful, whether my sons will end up having to go to war. I know it hasn't been completely peaceful in Europe, but at least we haven't had an all-out European war world war as we had before. That's a major, that could damage the economy big time if there are wars. Although, of course, there are people who make money out of wars, arms manufacturers and so on. We haven't mentioned Trident tonight, which it's a British thing, but the whole militarisation thing has got to be seen. That's a major issue with Europe. Europe, in my view, its main thing is to keep peace between European nations. I don't know why Britain insists on wanting to have a new weapon of mass destruction in the form of Trident, but we seem to think we have to have one. It's madness in my view. So it's the kind of Europe that we've got. So vote very carefully for the parties that you put in there.
Okay, thank you very much. That was the final question. I know a lot of people have tweeted questions tonight, and they'll all be available on Twitter for people to look at afterwards, and if our guests would like to look at them as well after the night, they'll be there. What I want to do now, just to wrap up, is to allow each of our guests 60 seconds to address any points that they might have wanted to earlier, to make any final pitches, and so on. I'm going to time this carefully, and we'll take them in the order that we took the opening pitches. So could we start with you, please, Edward?
Well, lost for words. I didn't expect that. Yes, I think to sum up, this election is about, it's banal to say, but it is about your future. And as Sian says, she's concerned about her sons and the future peace of the continent. It is better assured by working together than by working apart. I always say that if the European Union didn't exist, it would need to be created. It is not a perfect place. It is not a perfect set of institutions, but it is better than almost anything the world has ever seen before in terms of international cooperation. I'm proud to have been in the European Parliament for 30 years. I've seen big changes during my time there. Where we've got to now is a Europe which is really working for peace and prosperity across a continent and extending to countries which are desperate to join. And that might one day include Ukraine and yes, even Russia. So don't imagine that this is a static place. It is an exciting place to be. It's an important election. I do hope that those of you who are inclined to will vote Liberal Democrat, and anybody who wants to join the student Lib Dems, Harry Matthews is the only guy in the room wearing a badge at the back there.
We're up to 1 minute 14. Thank you. Thank you very much. Linda, the minute's yours, please. Thank you.
Well, just to say thanks to you for coming tonight in the pouring rain and listening to us. As I said before, MEPs are lawmakers. They're making decisions on your behalf, and you need to choose what party best represents your views. If you want to vote for somebody who's progressive, who will vote to defend the climate change agenda in the European Parliament, to defend tough environmental laws, women's rights, be very active on development issues and fair trade, I hope you will go out and vote Labour in the election, because that's what we stand for and that's what we're going to work hard to do in the next 5 years.
Thank you very much. And over to you, please, Sian.
Greens were within a whisker of a seat in the last European elections. We were sadly beaten by, I think, 1.something% by the BNP. It was a protest vote, and unfortunately they could have voted for the Greens as a protest vote, but people didn't know enough about us, I don't think. As I said, it's difficult for us to get our policies across. A lot of people think we're just environment. They don't realise that we're social justice. You cannot have environmental justice without social justice. The two are completely together. So we hope this time we will get our first MEP in Yorkshire and Humber. And there are individual excellent MEPs from other parties, as we've seen tonight, but you have to look at what the parties stand for. If you want a coherent set of policies which is really progressive and which is really looking at the need for changing things for the better, then you need to vote Green.
Thank you very much. And over to you, please, Nick.
Okay, thank you. Basically, if you want real change, vote Conservative, because then we get our referendum, and that is it. One thing I'm concerned about, though, is that we've not spoken about is the absolutely dire turnout at European elections. We have had always had it in Britain, very, very low turnouts. So I was intrigued at having a show of hands to see how many of you are actually going to go out and vote. Good. I'll take your mates. Obviously, well, and ask them to vote Conservative too.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of our candidates who braved bad weather, biblical storms, and who knows what else to join us tonight. It's been a really enjoyable and informative debate, and thank you on behalf of the Department of Politics and Exchange. Thank you very much.